BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts, on the road. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And before we begin today, I would like to give a shout out to YouTube user Chris Tendu, who said, "I don't think you have covered Rick Marshall as a Zodiac killer suspect. Every other suspect you have discussed and did a great job, so why not discuss Rick Marshall?" And that's exactly what we're going to do today. But as you see, this is a topic that was suggested by one of the listeners. So if you have any ideas for things that you would like to hear about or you would want covered on the channel, please drop your idea in the section below. And Zodiac killers, serial killers, true crime, but any subject is fair game. We often do those things. However, any subject, no limits. What do you want to hear about? Please drop your idea in the comments section below. And the comment under Chris says here is that, where was Rick Marshall from? Well, for this one, first I would like to jump over to ZodiacKillerFacts.com, and I was going through some of the other sites as well as some of the material on YouTube about Rick Marshall, and he was definitely born in Texas, but much like the Zodiac killer suspect Lawrence Kane, Rick Marshall was moving all over the country, particularly the western part of the United States of America during his lifetime before finally settling in California. For a time he was in Roswell, New Mexico, for a time he was in Washington State, and then of course in California. And he was definitely in California during 1968 and 69. And the thing we have over from Zodiac Killer Facts is Rick Marshall was born in the state of Texas in 1928. And the thing that they left out here, though, is that he didn't... his birth name was Joe Don Dickey, and I read that on ZodiacKiller.com, and he would go in between the two different names, Richard Marshall and Joe Don Dickey, and they didn't provide an exact explanation for that, but once again, we see this from people throughout these decades, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It really is not that unheard of. I mean, it's not that uncommon, I should say. It's not unheard of for people to use aliases during those decades once we've been looking into them. Richard Marshall developed a fascination with electronics and old films, and he eventually worked as a projectionist at a movie theater in San Francisco. He also worked as an engineer for the Bay Area radio station KTN. A ham radio enthusiast, Marshall talked with other radio buffs once invited some listeners to visit his home. Upon their arrival, the guests found that the host was peculiar and soon suspected that Marshall was indeed the infamous Zodiac killer. And the movie theater that they are talking about there, I believe, is called The Avenue, and they showed silent films, and that's where Marshall was working in 1968 and 69. But the thing to say about that is, when we did our upload on Richard Gaikowski ages ago, but still, we talked about how Gaikowski would also go on to work in a movie theater, and then there are going to be references to contemporary films eventually in the Zodiac Killer mystery. Once you get to 1974, you're going to have things like the Exorcist letter, then you're going to have things like the Red Phantom letter, and people are really beginning to think that this is not just somebody who is a moviegoer, that this person actually worked either in a movie theater, or you heard some of the other things that Rick Marshall did, working in radio, perhaps some type of sound engineering. I'm not too convinced by that because, once again, the references that are found in the Zodiac Killer mystery that are dealing with film are very general, they're very simple, they don't really reveal a lot of technical information, and this whole concept of, well, he had to have been working in a movie theater to reference contemporary film, I'm not buying that, and we're just going to be kind of jumping all over the map. I was actually quite surprised when I read that on ZodiacKillersite.com, ZodiacKillerFacts.com, when they said that Rick Marshall was born in 1928, because I want to jump over to ZodiacKiller.com. I was almost certain they said that he was born in 1926, and they did. So I'm on ZodiacKiller.com, and they said that Rick Marshall was born on March 13th, 1926, and he used the name Richard Reed Marshall throughout his life, but he was born Joe Don Dickey in Slatton, Texas, in Lubbock County. I think the reason why perhaps they wrote 1928 on the other website was because for a while, Rick Marshall would say that he was born in 1924. He altered his birth date as well. I mean, he's not the first person to do that, but saying that he's born in 24 versus 26 or even 28, as you heard. And I mean, like, he's just using some different things. Like, they're also saying just I don't think he's being consistent with all of the things that he is sharing with people. And then for a while, Rick Marshall would work in Seattle, Washington during the 1950s and take a job with Boeing. Now, I read this, no, sorry, I didn't read it. I was watching it on a YouTube video from Zodiac Killer, the Zodiac Killer channel. If you haven't heard their documentary Obsession into Darkness yet, highly recommend that. It's coming out in a series of uploads. But they were talking about Rick Marshall working for Boeing and how the Zodiac Killer said that after the Paul Stine murder, he never left any fingerprints behind because he coated his fingertips with airplane cement. And a lot of people began to think, oh, we got to be dealing with somebody Air Force, we got to be dealing with a pilot, we got to be dealing with somebody like Marshall, who had a connection to working with Boeing in the past. Somebody left just a comment here on YouTube that the airplane cement that they're talking about is for model airplanes, not real airplanes. That was just a comment that somebody left on the upload here. They're saying it's like glue. It's like the cement that holds a model airplane together, so that doesn't have to be a definitive airplane connection. Like, a definitive Air Force pilot or like this working for Boeing connection. Over the next 4 decades, Marshall lived in San Francisco, San Rafael, and San Jose, finally being moved to a care facility in Sacramento, California, where he died from issues caused by Parkinson's disease in 2008. During the Zodiac crimes in 1968 and 69, Marshall worked at a San Francisco silent movie theater called The Avenue. On Marshall's 45th birthday, March 13th, 1971, the Zodiac Killer mailed a letter to the Los Angeles Times newspaper. And yes, I mean, that really is something. We should, first and foremost, you can say, letter mailed on the birthday. Maybe that's a coincidence, maybe it's not. But also, Rick Marshall would have been 45 in 1971, doing some fast math, and that means that he would have been 43 2 years earlier in 1969. For the longest time, I really thought that we were going to be dealing with a Zodiac Killer who was in his early 20s, mid-20s, thereabouts. I really thought that because of a few reasons, and I'm not going to lie to you. I was somewhat influenced by the Zodiac Killer copycat Eddie Seda from New York, the New York copycat, and he was in his early 20s, and once you begin to look at some of the other suspects who were in their 20s, I was like, now wait a second, maybe we're dealing with a younger person, like much younger. I was also a big proponent of the Louis Myers theory, who would have been 17 at the time of the first murder. I really thought that there was some a grain of truth in that one, but a lot of the suspects that people are going to be talking about were much older, like such as we said, we already mentioned Lawrence Kane once, but also Hal Snook would have been in his early 40s during these murders, if you want to entertain the possibility of Hal Snook being a Zodiac Killer suspect. In the early 1970s, Rick Marshall worked as an engineer for the San Francisco Bay Area radio station KTIM. And if you ever get a chance to hear Rick Marshall's voice, he talks in a very bizarre way. And I mean, I think it's like left over from his radio announcer days, where there's just something abnormal about it. In 1976, Marshall became a Zodiac suspect after making suspicious comments over his ham radio. And that was something else that, we were discussing, where he invited some people over to his house to talk about the Zodiac Killer, and then they really began to think that he was the Zodiac Killer. But, I mean, I gotta tell you, this guy does himself no favors. And, Marshall agreed to be interviewed by Zodiac detective Ken Narlow, but denied being the Zodiac Killer. In 2001, he emailed Tom Voigt, becoming the first suspect to ever email Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com, and Marshall was upset over a rather trivial detail about ZodiacKiller.com. Now, like many people, the first place that we learn about some Zodiac Killer suspects is on ZodiacKiller.com. That's the first time that I ever saw Rick Marshall's name. His name hasn't been up there for, like, ever. He was maybe taken down and then put back up. But Rick Marshall wanted to tell Tom Voigt this, and this was the biggest thing that stayed with me when I first began reading up on Rick Marshall in the past, and then I just put him on the back burner, and I really didn't think too much about him. But what he said was, subject, silly man, 2 exclamation points, from Rick Tick, spelled R-I-K-T-I-K. How can you waste time and energy on this dead horse? Your information regarding me is 5th or 6th hand. I have never lived in a warehouse in Marin. I leased an industrial property at 36A Front Street, in which it included a 4-room, fully equipped apartment. If I find any further scurrilous, debasing, dope-handed out from this source, be prepared to defend a personal damage suit by a first-rate attorney. Signed, Richard R. Marshall. Okay, though. So the thing to say with that one there is that sounded so human to me when I read it the first time. And I was like, this guy leased the industrial property. He leased, which we can only gather is a warehouse from the minimal content of this email. It's like, so he's leasing this warehouse. It also has this 4-room, fully furnished apartment in it. He probably thought that was really cool. And he probably even wanted to show that off to people. Oh yeah, it also has an apartment unit. This is really neat. Yeah, want me to give you a tour? Like, he probably thought that was something just, really interesting about the property that he was leasing, and then somebody was calling him out on that, and that's why he defended himself. But I have to say, though, Richard Marshall is very awkward of an individual, and I mean, everything about him seems to be like somebody who is perhaps coming at things in somewhat of an attention-seeking way, and I'm really not very impressed with this guy, but the thing that I would like to do now is to jump over to Zodiac Killer Case's YouTube channel, which has an audio clip of Rick Marshall. There are a couple of these on the internet. You can also find one on ZodiacCiphers.com, and we're going to listen.
Who shared characteristics with Zodiac and was questioned by police.
I must have a double floating around. I hope the poor guy doesn't look like me, but the fact is that the characteristics you just mentioned fit me almost to a T. I really am startled at the mass and accuracy of the detail. And obviously, if they had been that forthcoming about that at the time, I would have understood why they were investigating me. My innocence notwithstanding, the details do fit.
And as we said, he does talk in a very awkward way. I just think that Richard Marshall is a very awkward person. But what's my favorite line on this channel, to any of the long-time listening Black Box Online Radio listeners? Being weird is not a crime. I definitely think that he had a certain amount of attention-seeking that was going on during his time for a while. But as you heard in that email that he had written to Tom Voight in the early part of the new millennium, he was actually rather mad that people were still looking into this, or they're going about this in a particular way. It's almost like if you're going to look at me as a Zodiac Killer suspect, do it in a glorious way. Don't try to make it seem like I'm some guy who lives in the corner of a warehouse. But I think we've shared all the things we had to say about this on the email. As far as the voice, we'll definitely remember that Nancy Slover described the Zodiac Killer's voice after she talked to him, like being the dispatcher from 911, as somebody who was speaking with an unusual cadence, not an accent, but just there is like a very flat monotone voice, and then at the end there's the famous goodbye, and I definitely noticed peculiarities about Rick Marshall's voice. I said it's possible that was carried over from his days as a radio broadcaster. The voice that I thought that most resembled Nancy Slover's description of the Zodiac Killer was Gareth Penn, but you can hear him on YouTube. And I don't necessarily know 100% if there's any connection there, but I definitely would put him up more so than Rick Marshall as matching that description. With Marshall, it seems like he is trying to pull himself into this. It seems like maybe he even enjoyed being somewhat of a Zodiac Killer suspect. And I say somewhat because, I mean, like, at the time, these are things that were started much later on. It doesn't appear that the police were looking at him in 1969. Now, going over to ZodiacCiphers.com, I would like to begin with one thing here. Although no hard facts tie Rick Marshall to any of the Zodiac crimes and communications, here is some information to consider with regards to one of the featured suspects in the 2007 film directed by David Fincher. Okay, before we say anything about that, no hard facts. I mean, one of the things that I just really hope we can find when we're looking at Zodiac Killer suspects is, where are the hard pieces of information? Where are the hard facts? Like, how are you getting this person to the crime scene? Do they have any physical evidence left behind? Do they have a witness description? I don't necessarily think that Xenophon Anthony is the best Zodiac killer suspect, but there's that very famous story now of that an eyewitness recognized him as being the person who was walking away from Paul Stein's cab on October 11th of 1969. With Rick Marshall, I can see certain reasons why people would think of him as a Zodiac killer suspect, but it also appears as just that he was a very awkward, attention-seeking individual. And ZodiacCiphers.com also gives the birth date of 1926 for him. I read off 1928 the first time because that was what was written, but it appears that he's just using multiple birth dates. Richard Reed Marshall was born Joe Don Dickey in Lubbock, Texas on March 13th, 1926. Did I say 1926 earlier? Which would have made him 43 years old in 1969. Regarding the murder of Paul Stein, the taxi driver, on October 11th, the three teenagers were the only eyewitnesses to contribute a description to the typed police report following the man last seen walking north on Cherry Street from Washington Street. They described him as a suspect in his early 40s. And, you might miss a lot of things, but I don't necessarily think that you would mistake a 20-year-old for a 40-year-old, so we definitely could be dealing with somebody closer to that range. As you can see, though, I don't seem 100% convinced that Rick Marshall was the Zodiac killer. I also do not seem to think that a lot of the material that people are putting forward is suggesting that he had any involvement with this, based on how passionately he appears that he wanted to be connected to the mystery in somewhat of a glorious way. Some guy who just wanted the attention of it. Total first instinct. I didn't know the guy personally. I've never corresponded with him like Tom Voigt has. I've never talked to him or in an interview the way you heard on YouTube, but that is my first impression of the subject. But I do insist you would not mistake a 20-year-old for a 40-year-old. Sometimes, though, I've met people that are like 30 or 31 and they're actually in their 40s. They look like they're 30 or 31, but they are actually in their 40s, and vice versa. You meet someone who looks like they're 38 or 39 and then they're in their late 20s or early 30s. That definitely does happen, but that's 10 years. That's 10 or 11 years, not a 20-year age difference. 2 minutes further, eyewitnesses overlooking the Julius Kahn playground, probably from the houses in Spruce Street, stated that the man was about 40 years old, leaving Paul Stein's cab. All these witnesses gave near identical descriptions of clothing, height, hair, color, and style, and the wearing of glasses. Their average age of 40 matches closely to Rick Marshall in 1969. Yeah, but so do a lot of other suspects, as we said. A lot of people, we have 2,500 Zodiac killer suspects. Many of them would be in their 40s, and we also have to deal with body type and as well as likelihood and feasibility. He lived in the key areas during the majority of the attacks, residing in Riverside in close proximity to the murder scene of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966, and in a basement at 143 Scott Street, San Francisco. Now, this is one thing that kind of stood out to me. Like, in California, apparently it's not completely normal for every single house to have a basement, and the Zodiac did talk about having a basement. That is one of the things that stands out to people, and they have this quote here from ZodiacCiphers.com. They're quoting the Zodiac killer saying, "What you do not know is that the death machine is at site or whether it is being stored in my basement for future use. What you do not know is whether the death machine is at the site or whether it is being stored in my basement for future use." So, the Zodiac did say that, but once again, that could also be referring to an industrial property of some sorts. If we're going to use that terminology, it doesn't necessarily have to be a home basement. Many people might have had access to this, but Rick Marshall's home at 143 Scott Street was also just 450 feet as the crow flies from the murder site of Sergeant Richard Radich, who was gunned down by 3 shots while seated in his patrol car. The Zodiac killer would lay claim to this murder in 1970 when he mailed the button letter, but I think that's the one that he also say, though, that he did not murder that person because he didn't want to move in on someone else's territory. Just going off of memory on that one. He would later move to Front Street in San Rafael in Marin County. Rick Marshall lived in San Francisco for about 20 years between 1969 and 1989. So he's in the area. And he definitely seems like a quirky individual. He seems like a bizarre individual. He seems like somebody who wants to deal with unconventional behavior. He worked in a movie theater during these times. The Zodiac would go on to reference contemporary film. Is that enough to connect this guy to the Zodiac Killer mystery at all? I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, and I don't want to sound like I'm being 100% dismissive. It sounds like this is a guy who is just making some annoying comments, for lack of a better term, and he knows that on purpose. He knows that he is being a little bit deviant. He is being unconventional. He is talking in a bizarre and confusing way, and one of the personality types who gets off on spreading disinfo or just being very weird. That's my overall gut feeling about Rick Marshall as a Zodiac Killer suspect. He's just a weird guy. But at the same time, I completely empathize with that thing about the warehouse, thinking that this is a really cool thing that I have. There's this property that I rented. Oh, it's going to be great. It even has an apartment unit in it that I can live in. And then somebody makes like some comment about they're trying to put him down. That was my response. What do you think about any of the things we have mentioned here in the Zodiac Killer upload on Rick Marshall as a Zodiac Killer suspect? If you have anything to say at all, please drop something in the comments section below. I would love to hear from you. Also, please share your ideas about future cases that you would like covered on this channel. I would love to hear from you, and you can, if you like this upload, you can hit the like button, and you can always hit that subscribe button as well. See you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.